All right, folks, thank you so much for coming to our last section of Wonk Week. Today, we're talking about budget reconciliation. I cannot think of a better topic to wonk out on. I can't imagine any other group of people getting this excited over a process called budget reconciliation. We're joined today by Rich Gold and Todd Wooden. Rich Gold is the leader of Holland & Knight's Public Policy and Regulation Group and focuses his practice at the intersection of complex policy and political issues involving Congress, the executive branch, and the media. The Public Policy and Regulation Group has been ranked among the top law and lobbying firms in Washington by publications including American Lawyers Influence Magazine, Legal 500, United States Guide, Financial Times, and U.S. News Best Lawyers Guide. Todd Wooden is an attorney in Holland & Knight's Washington, D.C. office and a member of the Public Policy and Regulation Group. He advises clients on legislative and regulatory issues, especially related to energy, tax, and technology issues. In addition, Mr. Wooden has served on 3 Senate committees for 4 senators. During his time on Capitol Hill, he served as the Director of Outreach and Senior Counsel for Energy and Tax on the Senate Committee on Finance, where he coordinated the committee's communications to businesses and organizations. Ooh, my mouth is dry. So I will turn it over to you, Rich and Todd.
Thanks so much, everybody, for having us today. I am your eye candy for the day, and Todd's the smart one here. You'll note that as we go along. I'm going to ask a rhetorical question up front just to kick this off, since we are talking about the nuts and bolts of budget reconciliation today. The only analogy I could come up with globally for budget reconciliation in sort of an area of knowledge that has very little use outside of the small group of people who work in that area of knowledge is something called the knowledge. And if you haven't taken a cab in London in the last 15 years, this will be arcane for you as well. But the course of study that you go through to learn every street in London and how to get from any place in London to any other place in London is called the knowledge. And as opposed to everywhere else in the world where we are all Ubered out and reliant on that, cabs in London are still a thing and are still sort of a historic construct. And you can hop in a car in London and be taken anywhere you need to go with the quickest route with somebody you know is going to get you there. And that's because they have studied and passed the test for the knowledge. So after we're done here today, you will not be prepared to take the test for the knowledge, but you will know a little something more about budget reconciliation, and that's really our goal for the day. It's my opening. What can I tell you? So budget reconciliation is really just has become a Senate shortcut to be able to move things through the Senate with 51 votes as opposed to 60, as would normally be the case, thereby allowing a majority with fewer than 60 members to move issues that otherwise would founder on the Senate floor. There are significant limits to budget reconciliation, and we are seeing those limits right now. First of all, most importantly, you still need 51 votes. And obviously Democrats have been running into that issue for the last, couple to 3 weeks. As we sit here right now, we are told this afternoon that Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema are preparing to announce a joint group of issues that they would be able to support in the reconciliation process. Basically, their offer to progressives on how to move forward. We'll see if that comes about while we're talking online here. But in addition to the 51 vote limitation, there's also this nasty little thing called the Byrd Rule, named after Senator Byrd from West Virginia, who many of you will remember, that blocks extraneous provisions from being added that do not, quote unquote, materially affect revenue in the budget process. And really, that is meant to prevent comprehensive policy legislation or major policy changes in federal law from being enacted through the reconciliation process. So if there's no budgetary impact or minimal budgetary impact, and it is clear that the impact of a provision is mainly in terms of changing policy, then with a point of order raised to the parliamentarian and a decision by the parliamentarian, that provision can be stricken from the reconciliation bill pending before the Senate. So that kind of outlined a little bit of the exercise we're going through, not only on the 51 vote count, but on what can be in, what can be out. You saw in the spring when we were doing the American Rescue Plan, the most obvious concerns around reconciliation and what would fit under the Byrd rule, what would not, from the perspective of including the minimum wage increase, which the parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough rejected in the American Rescue Plan as not material affecting revenue. The Byrd rule is broader than that, though, and includes a number of other provisions that limit what can and cannot be included. And we're going to go through that as we go along the way here, but did want to make sure you had that underlying course to get started. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Todd to kind of go through the timeline for what we expect to be going on this fall as we weave through the next few weeks after the last couple of weeks of discussions around reconciliation, et cetera.
Perfect. Thanks, Rich. Before we go through the timeline, just a little brief bit about kind of the history of this process and kind of how it came about, mainly because I really like Senate process. I really do. I kind of find it fascinating. I find it fascinating the way that things like this develop to try and keep some type of control of the body. So this process actually didn't exist until 1974. And the idea then was that you were going to use reconciliation to help you balance the budget. And so as you can see, you start with the budget, which Congress has to pass. In 1974, the kind of vision was that you would come back at the end of the year and you would look at that budget and you would say, did we spend too much? Did we spend too little? Whatever, and you would reconcile it. That's the name. And it was really that simple. It was about a balanced budget. That was in 1974. In 1975, the first attempt was made to kind of stretch the definition. And it's been that way ever since. People have tried to figure out various ways to accomplish their policy goals within this somewhat arcane process. So again, you start with a budget resolution. And once you pass that, it has various instructions to all of these committees or maybe a handful on what they are supposed to do whenever they move to the second phase, which is what we're all here to talk about. In the House, you have to actually pass your reconciliation instructions out of committees. That's the reason why over the last couple of months, you saw these various hearings over in the House where they marked up bills and they actually reported them out. You don't have to do that in the Senate, and you're not going to see that. With the margins being what they are at 50-50, if Senate committees tried to take up and actually pass out things, it's entirely possible you could have a variety of amendments, anything that they don't want to do. So over in the Senate, again, you don't have to do that. So it just goes straight from there. On the House side, you then package it all together in the Budget Committee, and it goes to the Rules Committee, which is where the current bill is stuck for kind of lack of a better term. Over in the Senate, you just have budget, so it goes there, and then it goes to the floor. Key to note, both with the budget and with the reconciliation bill, one of my favorite words, you do the vote-a-rama, where you can offer virtually any amendment because you're dealing with the federal budget, and so many things fit into that basket. Within reconciliation, you might be a little bit narrower. But either way, you go through this process where you will get a vote on your amendment if you want to. This is kind of crucial as we're talking about the debt ceiling. You can raise the debt ceiling in reconciliation. One of the last times it was done was actually in 1997. And that was in the Clinton years. And the interesting thing there was it was done where there were two reconciliation bills on one budget. You can do that. There are only three things that you can do. You can either spend money, you can raise money, or you can raise the debt ceiling. You can do, though, those things in three different bills on one budget. So that's where you see the Republicans and others saying, if you want to raise the debt ceiling, you should do it this way, and you can. So that's obviously something that we will see coming up. After the bills have passed after the bills have passed in their respective bodies, it's a very traditional process. You would go to a conference committee. However, you don't have to go to a conference committee. What you're seeing happen right now with the bill that's kind of stuck in House rules, that's a pre-conference. The House and the Senate are trying to work out their differences, so you don't have to do a formal conference committee, that you kind of have it baked before you go forward. And then it goes to the president's desk after both bodies have passed it. Of course, the president can veto it. What I was describing earlier, in 1974, in 1975, it was Russell Long who was trying to kind of stretch the definition. The bill, while it passed Congress, was vetoed by President Ford. So again, that's kind of whenever you get to the very end, it's a much more traditional path than obviously the beginning, where you get to take advantage of the 51 votes, but you're kind of subject to all those rules.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the proposals under consideration right now in reconciliation that may be tough, given the Byrd rule and the requirements you just heard about. So, we wanted to kind of go through briefly, and these are certainly not all of them, but the major provisions that may face a parliamentarian challenge, most likely by Republicans, if they get to the point of having the support of 51 Democratic senators. So let me let Todd start off with the Clean Electricity Payment Plan.
Clean Electricity Payment Plan. Again, this is a major point of contention. I think some folks would say that it's probably not going to go forward. This would be an effort to make utilities and other folks invest more in renewable energy to lower emissions. A key factor of the current reconciliation bill is that the idea is for it to be the most impactful piece of legislation on climate change ever. Sadly, it's a relatively low bar, but still, the idea is to have it do a lot. The Clean Electricity Payment Plan would be part of that. You would pay utilities in part to do better. You would also possibly have penalties. The issue here is whether or not it's really revenue-based. Because you really are trying to do policy. You're trying to affect energy policy. You're using the revenue measures. And so that's the way that they've tried to make it fit the Byrd rule. But there's an open question. It hasn't been ruled on. And so there are some people who think it would fall out if it did go to a Byrd rule challenge. But that's what they've been trying to avoid the entire time.
So that leads me into immigration, and I think with immigration we're sort of in the same territory we were in with the American Rescue Plan and raising the minimum wage. No question that there is some impact on revenue, but the role of the parliamentarian in the process is to determine whether there's a quote unquote material effect on revenue and whether that's the intent of the provision. And to that, she looks to the debate over the issue, the positions of the various parties in that debate. And here, pretty clearly, this gives every appearance, much as minimum wage did, of the majority trying to avoid 60 votes, knowing that this is really a policy provision of the Democratic Party and not principally about, raising revenues in terms of increasing tax revenues from new immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. So again, not anything that has been decided upon, but based on existing precedent, it looks like that's going to be a stretch. And you can kind of see that in the approach Democrats are taking on this. They're going to push for it because politically they have to push for it. But I think the expectations are low that it will end up in the final bill. Todd, kick it to you for labor.
And now this is where it gets really, really wonky. Labor provisions and waivers. This applies probably most in the context of tax credits for solar and wind and other technologies. For a long, long time, there's been a push that, moving to those technologies is going to grow jobs here in the US, and it has. However, within the labor community, they would say that those jobs have not had the protections that workers should have. They're not necessarily the wages that they should have. So, as currently envisioned, with those tax credits, you would have various requirements on prevailing wage or whatever else, labor provisions. The issue again is that revenue base. That kind of sounds like a policy. It sounds like a policy, again, to focus on workers, focus on labor issues, et cetera. It doesn't sound exactly revenue based. So because of that, what you're probably going to see in the bill is you can't basically say you get the credit if you do this, you don't get the credit if you don't do that. That's policy. So instead, what they'll probably do is slice it up and they'll say you can get 15% of the credit if you don't follow these provisions, but we'll give you the other 85 if you do. And that gives it enough of a revenue effect that it probably qualifies. However, there are also waivers that are associated with these. If you can't find the workers, if for whatever reason it would raise the cost too much for the project, then you could get a waiver. Well, that looks a lot like a policy. That looks like saying that maybe these things are not as easy as we thought. You should have a waiver. So there's a question as to whether the waivers can actually survive the Berg rule. So that will be a major point of contention because if those provisions fall out, you're not going to hit your climate goals. So that's a very, very big one, which is kind of looming down the road. Final one, I think actually is pretty straightforward. Obviously, voting rights is on the top of everyone's mind. There are a number of people who think it's very important for Dems to do and just to get it done. It is almost certainly purely policy. There's virtually no way that I can think of, and I think Rich agrees, that you can attach a substantial revenue effect to that. But that said, you're going to see a lot of people who are not necessarily happy about it.
Yeah, and I think the other reason, just to talk about this for a minute here, is to mention sort of the elephant in the room that for African American, other minority voters, the voting rights legislation, along with police reform legislation, is a core sort of bar for why they voted for Biden, and they are expecting movement in that space. So obviously, with our answer on reconciliation, that leaves only two other, literally possible alternatives on moving voting rights or police reform legislation. One, somehow developing compromise legislation that would achieve 60 votes in the Senate. Obviously, you are probably aware that police reform legislation has fallen down and negotiations have broken off in that space. The second thing, which you hear discussed from time to time, is not ripe yet, but is sort of out there on the horizon, is do we change the filibuster requirement, which is changeable via Senate rule, again, working with the Parliamentarian, to allow a specific narrow exception to the filibuster for civil rights legislation, which is something that members have been talking about for decades now. The civil rights legislation in the 60s took many, many years to pass, was difficult. The filibuster was clearly used, by white Southern senators to kind of keep it from happening until it finally broke through. So that question is out there. Now, we don't think at the end of the day we're going to see a change in the filibuster because it would require all Democrats to support it. And people like to point at Senator Manchin on that count a lot, but there are a number of other senators with significant concerns about changes to the filibuster of any sort. And as Senator Manchin has said of late, a lot of them are hiding behind him. So while I wouldn't rule anything out for sure, it seems highly unlikely that we're going to end up there on something like voting rights or police reform at the end of the day, barring something unforeseen happening that we're not currently aware of. So that moves us to our next slide. So we have told you all the things that probably are going to be difficult to get into this bill. What does that leave? What is going to be in this bill? And let me just set the table a little bit here. The president's goal at the end of the day when he ran, and I think now, is to create a bill here following the infrastructure bill that the average person would be able to look at and understand what the government is doing for them in this bill. Too often, when we pass these major omnibus bills over the last several decades, the average person looks at it and it's just big gobbledygook. You can think of the end of the year appropriations process as the best example of that. So that's really the goal here is, and what you see on your screen are real things for real people, right? We're not just talking about arcane government programs that don't impact individuals in their daily lives. So we'll start off, I'll kick it to Todd on climate and energy, and I'll handle kids and healthcare.
Sure, we'll try and move through. This is what we were referring to earlier. The major bulk of the spending here would be in various tax credits, incentives for EVs, potentially what we mentioned earlier, the Clean Electricity Performance Plan. One way that people have thought that might be more politically palatable would be to only offer carrots, to have no sticks. If you do that, you have to pay a lot of people, and that costs money. The bulk, though, does fall into the tax code. The kind of interesting thing to think about there, because this is going to be an issue, the idea within this reconciliation bill was that, you would set this up in such a way that you took action within climate and energy, that you could meet your 2030 goal as it relates to greenhouse gas emissions. The modeling on that would show you that the tax provisions alone, which again make up the bulk of the spending, probably get you 70% of the way there. So something that you're probably going to hear as this debate goes on is, where is that other 30%? And that was why that was why the SEP, that was why people were talking about that. And that's going to be an issue kind of as they go forward.
So on the health and sort of life cycle suite, you can see if you add all this up with the permanent extension of the child tax credit, or the extension for the life of the reconciliation bill, healthcare additions, including number of options with Medicare, and then both child care, pre-K, and free community college, you are talking about, just on those life cycle items, well north of $2 trillion. Now, we didn't talk a lot about this up front, but our expectation at the end of the day, based on what all the parties are saying at this point, is that we're going to end up somewhere between 1.5 and 2 trillion. So that would obviously leave, very little on the table for climate and energy things, other items that members want to include along the way here. So right now, the leadership on both sides with the president and the National Economic Council are sorting through, how do we either reduce the price of some of these items by ramping up over time, or ramping down, as the case may be, only have them go for a period of 5 years, maybe instead of 10 years, et cetera, et cetera. And some of these items, like the child tax credit, policymakers expect to become a permanent part, of our tax system. It's very popular. You probably heard the statistic already that 50% of young children have been lifted out of poverty by the inclusion of the tax credit in the CARES Act in the first place. So it's a very positive policy tool to use in that sense. And so you can kind of take the gambit here that if we only include that item for 5 years, that a future Congress will almost certainly have to renew it. Similarly, Medicare expansion, we've obviously never expanded Medicare and then contracted it later on. All of those expansions have continued. The things that are looking a little bit more tenuous right now, free community college is looking like an item that really may be tough given the price, and seems to be sort of losing out in the education battle to childcare and pre-K. The other thing that's not on our list that looks like it may be difficult is affordable housing funding. Again, that may be something they try to shovel in at the end of the day at a lower price, but it's a couple $100 billion, and it's going to be very, very difficult if we're scaling back from where we already are. So you can see we're talking about in all of these things, items that the average taxpayer is going to be very well aware of. Some of them skew younger or older. For instance, the climate energy piece obviously is going to be very popular with 18 to 30 or 35-year-olds, which is an important voting bloc for Democrats. Healthcare will be obviously skewing for older, seniors and just below seniors. And then obviously with childcare and pre-K and the child tax credit, married couples with children. So you can see the effort by Democrats to try and hit the full life cycle here and all interest areas in their party. So we're going to move on to, okay, that's what we're spending money on. What are we doing to raise money? And the plus side of having decreased the total price of this thing from 1.5 to 2 trillion from 3.5 originally is you have to do less in terms of raising revenue. So I'm going to let Todd walk through these.
Sure. Again, I think these are a lot of things which have been circulating. As it relates to the corporate rate, Senator Manchin has said that he could accept 25, going from 21% to 25%. Obviously, the 21% rate came about in a different reconciliation bill in 2017. Yeah, 2017 in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But now, again, you can raise it 4 points from 21 to 25. You raise roughly $400 billion, not quite. When you cut taxes, you lose about $100 billion in revenue. Whenever you raise them, you don't necessarily get that $100 billion back. There's an assumption that economic growth is hindered, so you don't get quite the same amount. On the international tax side, obviously in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they looked a lot at various measures as it relates to the international taxation of both foreign companies and also domestic companies. There are some folks who certainly want to make changes there. They still feel that we're still not collecting as much as we should, and so they're looking at that too. Those are your major raisers. And again, while Senator Manchin has said that he can go from 21 to 25, Senator Sinema has said that she has real concerns, and we'll actually get to what she would do. Just one more down the road. Rich, I don't remember if it was you or me who was going to talk about the increase in the top individual rate. I'm happy to.
Go ahead.
Anytime I can talk about people's taxes going up, as a Democrat, I get really excited. It's a total joke. So the increase in the top individual rate, again, this would take it from 36%, which is in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, to I believe 39.6, which is what it was at before. This is, part of what folks have campaigned on, talking about that the people at the top end of the income bracket pay their fair share. And so this would be a way to do that. Same thing with cap gains. Again, what you're typically looking at there are folks with the means to invest in various things, and there have been people wanting to raise the cap gains rate for a while. Those are relatively significant raisers. They're almost in the realm of the corporate rate. Again, some of it depends on what you do. As it relates to cap gains in particular, your real issue is kind of how you start it. You could go retroactive. You could say, hey, we've been talking about raising the cap gains rate for a year. You should have known that. You can unwind any deal that you have in a year, so let's make it retroactive. People will hate that, and I don't think that that's what they will do, but you can. But your issue is if you say, we're going to raise the cap gains rate on January 1st, 2022, then obviously there will be a rush of people who will be trying to take advantage of the current rate then. So you end up kind of skewing what's going on in the market. That kind of leads to the third one. And again, this is where Senator Sinema has said she doesn't like raising the top rate for she doesn't like raise the top rate for anyone for either corporations or on the other side, but she is interested in compliance. Compliance is the amount of taxes that we are actually owed compared to the amount of taxes that we actually collect. This is where I believe it's $40 billion for enforcement at the IRS. The the belief amongst some is that that would get you back, like, I think it was 400 billion. I can't remember the exact numbers at the moment. But again, it's about collecting taxes that we are already owed, the tax gap. The other thing that Senator Sinema has thrown out there and is causing a lot of consternation is an idea of a minimum corporate tax or a book tax. And what this would do is it would look at basically saying, if you're a corporation, you should owe this amount of money. And through skillful tax planning or deductions or whatever else, you're lowering that tax burden. Again, you see these things quite frequently where they say that GE or various corporation X doesn't pay taxes. That's through tax planning. I mean, they are paying taxes, but through deductions and whatever else, they're minimizing it. What Senator Sinema has said that she might favor, again, would be something that would kind of take away those deductions, and you would go to a tax which is just a straight minimum. In her view, that's compliance. And so while people have been frustrated with her, I think throughout this process, the reason why I note it is because it is thoughtful. I think corporations would scream. Most of our clients definitely do not want to do a corporate minimum tax. They don't want to kind of lose the ability to do some very creative tax planning. But it is a thing which is out there. And that brings us to the last one, which I certainly can let Rich speak to on healthcare and prescription drugs.
Sure. So obviously, prescription drug prices have been, a problem for a long period of time. This is actually a good example of where we start to see some split between Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema. Senator Sinema has real concerns about this as a razor, and it's being scaled back in real time, I think, as we're talking here, from originally allowing, Medicare to sort of negotiate drug prices on a pretty broad group of drugs to narrowing that group of drugs and limiting the ability of the government in order to negotiate. So this is an idea that's been out there for a long time. In fairness, and sometimes it's had some degree of bipartisan support, but obviously, the drug industry is a pretty powerful interest group in Congress, and people are very concerned anytime the government gets involved in a private market and starts putting price controls on, as everybody harkens back to the 1970s and runaway inflation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We expect that that's going to be on the borderline about whether it can make it across the finish line. No problems with the Byrd rule, but just literally the 51 vote thing. And in this case, Senator Sinema in particular. So I think that is the end of your 30-minute budget intro. I have heard budget reconciliation done in 20 minutes, probably better than we just did, but this is really an area that you could take a full semester college course on. It is very arcane. Obviously, we did the best we could in a quick period of time, but it's also an area that frankly is best to be talked about in conversation with questions. So please feel free to insert a question into the chat, or Patrick, we'll hand back to you and let you kind of quarterback here.
Perfect. Yeah. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button where you can submit questions. You can also throw them in the chat. We have one question here, which is, what do we know about the Parliamentarian?
Elizabeth McDonough, I'm going to hand that one to you, Todd.
It was a little funny for me to get to do this because I really like this topic, but candidly, I think I lost the last 3 times that I went before the Parliamentarian as I was leaving the Hill. She's amazing. I mean, she's very fair, loves her job, and is one of the rare people, I would say, who is respected by both sides on the Hill. The way that you don't necessarily bring up an objection to one of these provisions on the floor without knowing what's going to happen. And so that process is called the Byrd bath. And that's kind of what they're doing right now, where they go back and forth with her and her staff. And they say, well, if we did it this way, I mean, would you, have a problem? And they say, well, I don't know, you might have a problem because of X. And you get a sense through that of if you raise the objection, whether or not, it would actually pass. But she is, again, I would say one of the few people on Capitol Hill who is respected by just about everybody, not entirely everybody, but about as close as you're going to get in politics.
So going off of that, we have another question here, which is, realize it's far from likely, but given how partisan things are, is there a world where you see the POTUS overruling the advice of the parliamentarian?
So I don't think we're going to get there at the end of the day, because I'm trying to think on all the issues we went through. I don't think there's an issue that rises to the high level of gravity that would be overruling the parliamentarian, changing the rules, that will get through in the first instance the political screen of having Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema both supporting it. So from a very practical perspective, I don't see that happening, not because there won't be people itching to make it happen, but because I think those issues are the ones on our slide about things that may get, challenged along the way in the Byrd rule, like the clean electricity plan, that just may not ever get there, because Senator Manchin, may not be able to support it, and therefore it's not going to be part of the package as it goes to the floor. But Todd, I don't know if you can think of anything I'm missing.
No. I mean, you just have to remember how that process would work, right? Someone would raise a point of order, the parliamentarian would say, you sustain it, or she doesn't, and then you have to vote on overruling. So again, to kind of Rich's point, you probably lose Sinema and Manchin, and you have to remember, like with Manchin, this is Robert Byrd. And the way the Byrd rule came about was, as I was talking earlier, 1974, you start this process, 1975, you're already abusing it. And it really ramped up in the early years of Reagan. And so it was Byrd who kind of said in 1983, this is crazy. I mean, this is not why we passed that law in 1974. You guys are doing all this stuff and all this policy because you couldn't do it otherwise. And so it would be a big deal for Manchin to kind of throw out the Byrd rule. I mean, it's a pretty significant thing from a legend within his home state.
Another question here, which is curious your best guess on when the budget could be approved. Do you expect it to be before the end of the year?
So I think that we basically are somewhere between a 50 and a 60% chance of having it done by Christmas. And the interesting thing about that is I think the odds are much higher that we get done by Thanksgiving. If we go past Thanksgiving, I think the odds probably flip, and the odds then at that point are greater that we've run into some roadblocks along the way that push us into 2022. I think we're either going to, and Todd and I are both working on a bunch of provisions here. You definitely have the sense of these guys are in the hurry up offense now and trying to, kind of move through issues. They will either be successful on that, and we're going to get something done between Veterans Day and Thanksgiving, or they won't. And if they're not, I'm not sure the 2.5 or whatever 3 weeks post Thanksgiving is going to be enough for us to get there. So I do think there's a chance we go into Q1. Everybody needs to remember that the Affordable Care Act was the end of the first quarter of 2010. So, we're by no means like late on this or anything like that yet. I will tell you that there's a direct correlation, and it's a negative correlation, between the amount of time these packages take and their popularity immediately after they pass. Why does that matter, you're asking? Because Democrats have to hold the House and hold the Senate next year, theoretically. And, if we do go into the end of the first quarter or whatever, just like in-laws and fish that's been hanging around for a while, this thing is not going to smell too great.
In-laws. That's good. Speaking of which, what other obstruction maneuvers can Minority Leader potentially throw at Democratic senators?
Well, I mean, at this point, there's not much really that's left. Whenever you bring back the full bill, I suppose you're going to do, well, no, actually, you won't do a voter-on, I don't think. So at this point, there's not much. But of course, the issue isn't really with the minority leader at the moment. The issue is within the Democratic caucus itself. But in terms of procedurally, there's not a lot, because that was the way that this was designed, was to be able to kind of move through.
Yeah, I would just remind people of one thing, which is pretty critical in all this at the end of the day, because we're seeing sort of the internal, fighting among members of the Democratic Party between progressives and moderates right now. But keep in mind one thing at the end of the day. Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema are both up for re-election in 2024. And whether they like it or don't on any given day, their political futures are in some way, shape, or form tied to the president's agenda being successful. So that's going to mitigate towards Democrats at the end of the day pulling together and hanging together. So McConnell's doing sort of what he can, but at the end of the day, the power here really rests within the Democratic Party if they hold together. And I think the fact that both those senators stand for re-election, when they do, mitigates towards coming up with a package that everybody will support.
How does the debt ceiling negotiation play into this? And what does the Democratic majority plan to offer Republicans to have a chance to pass reconciliation?
So as I just said, I don't think they really need Republicans, and they're not going to get any to pass reconciliation. How the debt ceiling plays into this in December will be very interesting to watch. So obviously we just kicked the can down the road. As Todd told you up front, you can include the debt limit in reconciliation as we move forward, but that takes time and effort to, sort of go back and pass another bill with the debt limit in it. A lot of Democrats are resistant to taking that approach, and we really don't have a very clear pathway for how we're going to get there at this point. There has been all sorts of talk, including Todd's favorite resolution of the issue, the
coin. I love the coin.
Yeah, he wants to print the $1 trillion coin, but I think the Treasury Secretary has kind of poo-pooed that. So
that is a whole separate wonk conversation, is the coin, and I will absolutely do it, Patrick. But so the thing to know is, as I was saying earlier, you can do multiple reconciliation bills on one budget. So what you would do is you would pass a budget, this time, as Rich said, with reconciliation instructions. That would get you to a vote-a-rama. And you have Republicans saying that they wouldn't use all the time if it was just for debt ceiling. So you could go through it in some type of compressed fashion. But that's what you'd have to do. Is that chart at the very beginning with the timeline, you'd have to go back through that. Funny enough, like as we were doing this today, and I knew this would come up. The first time I heard about the debt ceiling was in 2003 when I was a very junior staffer, and I was asking my boss. I was like, "So what are we doing today?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, we're voting on the debt ceiling." I was like, "What's that? Ew, that sounds kind of scary." And it was like, "Oh well, whenever we run up against our spending and our credit limit, we have to raise it." And I said, "Oh my gosh, you mean that's going to pass?" And it was like, "Oh yeah, no, it's going to pass. We have to go ahead and do it." So I went back and looked. It passed 53-44 that day. Voting against it was Joe Biden and every other Democrat, with the exception of Zell Miller. So kind of an interesting thing to kind of think about, within this debate, is that obviously the debt ceiling has been a thing. It was never, ever in doubt, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the other party voted for it whenever they had to. So
yeah, I have described the debt ceiling, and I should disclose up front, I am a deadhead with more than 200 shows under my belt, but as it's kind of like going to a Grateful Dead concert, where you're going to end up at the end, you just have no idea how you're going to get there. And the other analogy I will use here, as folks who know me know, I worship at the ground of Mel Brooks, and in particular Blazing Saddles. And the debt limit is just about, I can't think of a thing that's more stupid that Congress has ever done than creating the debt limit. It literally is like Cleavon Little, the sheriff in Blazing Saddles, putting the gun to his head and, saying, "Don't approach or I'll shoot myself." It's the same. It's the same deal. It's like, what was Congress thinking that somehow this was going to be a good thing? It has not stopped, obviously, the growing of the national debt. It has nothing to do with keeping, the deficit from increasing. It is basically just a political baseball bat that the parties literally hand back and forth like the Bugs Bunny cartoons and just beat each other over the head with.
And so far, we've covered the London taxi system, Looney Tunes, and the Grateful Dead. And so I think with that, we'll call it a panel. Thank you so much, Rich and Todd, for joining us. And thank you, everybody at home or at work for joining us over the past week. This has just been an absolute joy for me. If you would love to hear your feedback, we have a little survey that we'll be sending out in the next couple of days. But until then, looking forward to seeing you all at hopefully next year's Wonk Week.
Enjoy the knowledge.
Thank you.